Welcome back, Night Dwellers. I'm your host, Mothie, and tonight we begin a story of curiosity and consequence. What starts as a simple dare, two boys, a graveyard, and a whispered legend, quickly spirals into something far darker. When they stumble upon an object left behind, a door opens to something that should have stayed buried. This is part one of Carved in Bone. Are you brave enough to listen?
Tune in close, dim the light, simple dark tales late at night.
The graveyard air was bitter, the sharp wind carrying the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. Reed crouched low behind a gnarled oak tree, its bark rough under his palms. Beside him, Tony shivered, his breath misting in the chill. Both boys peered cautiously around the trunk, staring at the hooded figures gathered near the center of the graveyard. The figures stood in a tight circle around a grave, their dark cloaks flowing like liquid shadow. Their low, melodic chanting sent goosebumps crawling over Reed's skin. The wind carried fragments of sound, twisting it into something that almost resembled words, half-formed, indecipherable, like a whisper at the back of his mind. "Do you think they're witches?" Reed said, the words barely audible. Tony turned, his face pale in the moonlight. "What else could they be? Look at them." Reed did not reply. Miss Eris Sambo's grave sat at the center of the circle. Her name was carved into the fresh headstone, the dirt still raw and unsettled. Everyone in town knew about Miss Sambo. To adults, she had been nothing more than a reclusive old woman, a shadow moving behind dirty curtains. But to the kids in the neighborhood, she was a witch. The witch. "Miss Sambo used to have vultures," Tony said. "Loads of crows, too. But the vulture was the weird one. You know what they say about her?" "Yeah," Reed said. He'd heard it all. About how she lived for over 100 years. About how she could talk to birds. The stories had gotten darker after her death. Her house torn down, the land left abandoned. Some swore she still lingered in her grave, her magic waiting to be disturbed. "She had this giant vulture that sat on her roof all night," Tony added. "Huge, like a car. My cousin says it wasn't natural." "Vultures aren't magic," Reed scoffed. "They're just scavengers. They eat dead stuff." Tony's face turned grim. "Yeah. But if something's already dead, what does it eat?" Reed did not answer. The ritual's chant reached a crescendo, the cloaked figures raising their arms towards the moon. Reed's fingers dug into the bark of the tree. Suddenly, the voices stopped. The group began placing items carefully on the grave, bundle of herbs, strange bottles, and something that glinted dully in the moonlight. Then, one by one, they turned and disappeared into the mist. The silence was heavier than before. Reed exhaled his breath, catching on the edge of his nerves. "They're gone." "You sure?" Tony said, eyes darting around. Reed didn't wait to answer. He stepped out from behind the tree, Tony stumbling after him. They crept forward, weaving between gravestones, the air thick with scent Reed couldn't quite place, earthy and metallic, like old blood. Miss Sambo's grave was littered with offerings. Flowers twisted into unnatural shapes, bundles of herbs tied with red ribbons, and at the center, a thin bone flute. It was no longer than a recorder, smooth and pale, its surface carved with looping, twisting patterns Reed couldn't understand. Do you think that's a human bone? Reed said. Tony recoiled. What's wrong with you? Don't touch it. But Reed was already reaching down. The bone flute was oddly warm, pulsating faintly, as if something inside it were alive. Relax, he said. It's probably fake. Tony stepped back, glancing nervously at the surrounding graves. This is a bad idea. This is like how you get cursed. Curses aren't real. Reed slipped the flute into his jacket pocket. Immediately, he felt a strange pressure in his chest, as though the air around him had thickened. He shrugged it off. See, nothing happened. Tony sighed and took out his phone, snapping a photo of the grave. Whatever, man. Let's just get out of here. This place is giving me the creeps. Reed did not argue. As they walked back toward the cemetery gate, the wind picked up again, carrying the distant cry of a bird, low and mournful. Reed glanced over his shoulder. The grave sat untouched under the moonlight, but for a brief moment he thought he saw movement in the mist. That night, Reed couldn't stop thinking about the bone flute. It sat on his nightstand, its carved symbols catching the glow of his bedside lamp. The warm pulse he'd felt earlier seemed to linger, like a heartbeat under his skin. He picked it up, running his fingers over its surface, the warmth returning, stronger now. Against his better judgment, he brought it to his lips. The sound that emerged wasn't what he expected. It wasn't the squeak of a recorder or the awkward notes of a toy. It was a melody, low, mournful, almost human. It filled the room, resonating deep in Reed's chest, and for a moment, he felt like he wasn't alone. The sound stopped. Reed set the flute down carefully, his hands trembling. Outside, the wind rattled the window. Then he saw it. A shadow perched on the street lamp across the road, a massive shape hunched low, wings drooping like torn cloth. The faint outline of feathers stirred in the breeze, but it didn't move. It was watching him. That concludes today's episode. Join us next week for another spine-tingling tale here on Simple Dark Stories. If you enjoyed this and would like to help out, please give us 5 stars and let us know what haunts your dreams. Until next time, bye-bye.